The New York Post reports scientists who wrote the paper dismissing the so-called lab leak theory of the origin of COVID admitted they feared blaming China for accidentally releasing the virus, according to internal communications obtained by a House subcommittee. A co-author of the March 2020 Nature Medicine article, quote, "The Proximal Origin of SARS-CoV-2," and other scientists who collaborated on the paper privately worried about the tshow, I'm censoring, that would happen if China in particular were deemed responsible for COVID escaping one of their research labs, according to the House Select Subcommittee on the Coronavirus Pandemic. Given the bleep show that would happen if anyone serious accused the Chinese of even accidental release, my feeling is we should say that given there is no evidence of a specifically engineered virus, we cannot possibly distinguish between natural evolution and escape, so we are content with ascribing it to natural process, said Dr. Andrew Rambout, a professor of evolutionary biology at the University of Edinburgh. Wrote that in February of 2020. It was a Slack message to Dr. Christian Anderson, Dr. Edward Holmes, and Dr. Robert Gary, all top scientists in this field, all dedicated to covering up what actually is very likely the cause of COVID. For more on this, I want to turn to David Asher. He's our go-to on this subject. He's a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute, a former State Department COVID investigator under the Trump administration. David, great to have you back with us, sir.
Thanks very much.
These are private messages that are being made public for the first time. What do they reveal to you?
Well, it reveals exactly what you just said, that it would be some show, as they said, if it came out, not just what China's role was, but really the role of American biologists in biology under Dr. Fauci's lead in transferring the technology, the know-how, money to the Chinese to conduct this type of dangerous research, so-called gain-of-function research that most likely led to the creation of COVID-19. It goes beyond just the blowback against the U.S. government and its involvement. It's the fear that Ron Faucier, who's the crazy mad scientist over in Europe who adopted the H1N5 influenza variant, as I recall, made it super infectious through a crazy experiment, was then published with Fauci's permission. He says that the whole thing could, if we raise the issue of potential unnatural origin, i.e. a lab accident, it would do unnecessary harm to science in general and science in China in particular. Let's not forget Fauci said, I'd rather have the experiments going on in Wuhan than Hoboken, New Jersey. I mean, the whole idea is that we outsource some of our most dangerous research to the Chinese. And moreover, now that even the Director of National Intelligence, in a terrible report that it did, that was supposed to declassify information, did admit that the Chinese military was directly receiving funding from the U.S. government to do this exact research. And it was a Chinese military program, as I've told you in the past, that was highly classified. And it was classified for a reason, because it was offensive in orientation. It wasn't defensive. They weren't just creating advanced coronavirus as whether it was a bioweapon or not. They were created as a capability that eventually could be used as a type of biological warfare agent.
Yeah, they were stockpiling a biological warfare agent. They were creating
the ability to create chaos in the world economy in the event of a Taiwan scenario, I believe. And of course, when it leaked out accidentally, it did create chaos in the world economy and kill 20 million people.
Can I ask you just a question that you've just provoked me in my mind about this, and it's definitely a tangent. But one of the things, I know China reported basically no deaths due to COVID for most of the time that we were all locked down. And the claim was that the Chinese were making was, one, that those are authentic numbers, and I always thought that was a lie. But two, that it proves that their communist system is much more effective than our capitalist system, and therefore they're better. That was kind of the claim. But I've always wondered, what if there was some authenticity to those numbers, in the sense that maybe fewer Chinese people died because the virus was tailored to avoid that outcome?
Well, we looked at that, so the so-called genetically selected agent, and this has been something the Chinese had actually talked about publicly. We couldn't find in our analysis conducted, when I say our, it was State Department directed, but the work was done by Fort Detrick, the Army Biodefense Command, Lawrence Livermore National Laboratories. I mean, real scientists. Okay,
Yeah.
I mean, we have scientists at state, but not. These are world-class biologists. DIA's National Center for Medical Intelligence. These are the people that know the most about biological agents. We just couldn't find evidence of it, but we do know the Chinese had that aspiration. But what they were trying to do initially was just to create a potential pandemic pathogen, COVID-19, that, if released, would bring the world to a halt and kill tens of millions of people, and would be stealthy and hard to attribute, which is exactly what came out in the hearing yesterday. I mean, it's interesting in these Slack messages, which is this messaging app that people use when they're putting together scientific papers and reports and research in corporate business communities everywhere, is the amount of conspiratorial activity among these scientists to consciously, even though they believe that it was 75-25 bioengineered, i.e. created in a lab, and most likely leaked from a lab, they rewrote their entire argument. And you can see it in the transcriptions of these messages among them, to tailor to Fauci's sort of request, in effect, and Francis Collins, who remains the president's top science advisor, to steer the argument away from a potential, biomedical origin of it, because that would hurt their business. NIH has spent $38.5 billion, I told you before, in biodefense under Fauci's lead since 2002. It didn't detect, disrupt, defend anything.
So that remark that you brought up a moment ago, that Fauci said we'd rather be doing this kind of research in Wuhan rather than Hoboken, New Jersey, that is a sign of how dangerous this is. I mean, in other words, what he's saying is the probability of a leak is non-zero, and therefore we would rather do this somewhere where we don't care as much about the population dying. But that's a pretty obvious statement from Fauci that this is very dangerous research.
Yeah, I mean, of course. And we had banned this type of research in the United States, and we'd let it continue in China for whatever bizarre reason. Some of it was being continued actually against NIH's decree, but they never enforced anything. They didn't even know what the Wuhan Institute was. I mean, this is the thing, that there was no counterintelligence. There was no analysis at HHS, which controls NIH, which is the biggest federal agency, into the risk associated with this research. It was all about, well, let's let the Chinese die if there's an accident or something. I mean, like, the whole thing was ridiculous.
Yeah.
I don't think the Chinese did this on purpose, but when it accidentally leaked, they absolutely covered up. And what's amazing in these transcripts that I wish the Congress had spent a lot more time, especially the Republicans, focusing on, rather than asking all these sort of random questions and points they were making in this hearing yesterday, because they could have really slammed these guys for having had a conspiracy to cover up, which is a federal crime. So what happened? Using federal money to do it.
Yeah. So what happens here is all of these scientists get together and collude to suppress a very legitimate theory into the origins of COVID, is that came from the lab in Wuhan. And even after they started writing their first draft of the scientific paper that was eventually used as a basis for worldwide censorship of this conversation, all the social media companies were adhering to this. They said, okay, we got to censor it. These scientists say there's no way it leaked from a lab. These very scientists behind the scenes, after they had even written the first draft of this, quote, proximal origins paper, you have Christian Anderson, who is one of the top guys here. He says, quote, the main issue is that accidental escape is in fact highly likely, he says in the transcript. It's not some fringe theory. That's funny, because he signed on to, once this all went public, they made it seem like it was a very fringe theory. That's not what he was saying behind the scenes.
And he said yesterday that I changed my view because of new evidence. But no one has any new evidence. If you look at his Slack messages, there's no new evidence. They changed their view because they decided it would be politically unacceptable for them to put out anything that would blame China. Scripps Institute was bailed out, I think, in 2018 by the Chinese government through a huge donation. That's where Anderson and Andrew Rambout, his colleague, is. Rambout refused to testify yesterday because he didn't want to incriminate himself. He's also a British citizen, but I think he's dual. I mean, this thing stinks to high heaven.
Yes.
But and of course, we've got 1 million dead Americans and counting, and no answers. And this just gets at the fact that they also admitted yesterday, these two experts, that they had consulted both with the FBI, which is in the news today, and for the CIA on their assessment, which is, at least the FBI came out with an assessment ascribed the most likely origin as a lab leak, but the rest of the intelligence community hasn't, except for Department of Energy. So this is the biggest cover-up in the history of the U.S. government. Really, It makes Watergate and everything look like nothing. And what I'm afraid is blame is getting shifted further and further away from the Chinese.
Yes.
And the Chinese are essentially sitting there in Beijing like, we can get away with mass murder, and there's no hell to pay. I think it's a major problem.
It also, these messages also highlighted, at least for me, the word games that Anthony Fauci was playing every time he testified before Congress. Rand Paul would constantly confront him about what we refer to as gain-of-function research, which makes these viruses more lethal and infectious to humans. And Fauci would continuously insist that there's no evidence that the virus was genetically modified or engineered in order to suggest that it was of natural origins. But in the chats here, in these messages that I'm reading now that are just being made public, they talk about something called passaging, which is a way to sort of force a virus to mutate while still leaving the virus looking natural. Isn't that the right thing?
Yeah, you inject like a bat a virus into a rhesus monkey, which has a lot of high degree of genetic similarity with a human being, and you then go back and forth, cycling it back and forth, and you can bring in these strange animals like pangolins, which have a very high receptor binder affinity to the COVID-19 receptor binder, which is crazy because how did that, as John Stewart said, how did the pangolin, this anteater like thing, mate with the bat? Well, they didn't. Their blood was transfused among each other, essentially injected between each other and other types of fluids,
right,
in order to create a convolution, an artificial evolution. That's what they do in these experiments. But this is exactly what the Chinese had publicly said they were working on with the support of the National Institutes of Health. And, unfortunately, other government agencies as well. No one seemed to think that might be related to China's biological weapons program, which it most definitely is. I mean, when the DNI, the intelligence directorate, came out and said it was the military that was part of this whole thing, well, what they really meant, it was the Chinese biological weapons program that was part of it, and they just don't want to. They say this wasn't a biological weapon, I guess, because it wasn't in some canister and dumped on top of New York City or something. It had the same effect. It was dumped all over the entire world. I mean, so, again, we've got is a situation of a cover-up. I will say, and I'll send you a document in a second that you might want to post. The DIA, Defense Intelligence Agencies, the National Center for Medical Intelligence, which is the absolute premier agency in charge of analyzing biological threats for the U.S. Defense Department, has an unclassified analysis that was entered into the congressional record yesterday at this hearing that in 6 pages demolishes this so-called proximal origins paper, these academics saying that this thing came out of a natural host. And it takes the same information and reverses it. And these are the absolute experts in the U.S. Military on biological agents. And their analysis is this 100% was a synthesized, biosynthesized creation, Frankenstein's monster that was, one way or another let loose by the Chinese. And the sequence itself shows that this is not natural. And therefore, that is the most powerful piece of unclassified information that's available. Unfortunately, the other information was supposed to be unclassified. All the stuff I worked on, that was supposed to be classified, it's still classified, so I can't talk about it. But this is one document that gets at what we were looking at, at the level of the Secretary of State on down, and the Secretary of Defense. And I'll make sure you have it to post. It's 6 pages long. People can read it. Very well written.
That sounds very fascinating. And so David Asher, this document, this unclassified DIA document, was this a document that was put together by the current administration, or was it?
No, it was put together during it was in I believe it was put together in April of 2020, issued in May. And it went to all it not only, there was a classified version of it too, but the unclassified version tells you all you need to know. And it basically is a rejection of this proximal origins paper that these guys testified about yesterday as being so, above holier than thou, et cetera. It basically trashes it. And it's done by a scientist named Commander Jean-Paul Chrétien, who is not just the Navy commander, he has a PhD and MD in genetic science from Johns Hopkins. The guy's like literally the U.S. government expert on this area. And he worked at Fort Detrick, where the experiments are actually conducted to try to simulate these types of things. So whether he was involved in those experiments to try to duplicate the conditions of SARS, COVID-19 or not, he has absolute domain expertise. He makes these professors look like chumps, and Fauci too. And he just demolishes them. And this was an analysis that went up to the president. It went to the Secretary of State. And it resonated with lots of stuff that we know from other sources we can't talk about.
Yeah.
I'll just say that.
Yeah. I mean, I remember when President Trump finally started saying in public that he suspected the lab leak and he couldn't really share much. I imagine he was informed by a lot of that at the time.
It was a lab leak of a bioengineered creation. This is a Frankenstein. This is not something that came out of a zoonotic host or a natural setting. It may have been introduced into a natural setting accidentally, but it most definitely, it was, as Dr. Redfield said, it was optimized to spread from day one. There's no naturally occurring virus that just mutates like that in a period of days and suddenly can kill half of humanity. It's crazy.
Yeah, it is crazy. David Asher, thank you very much for staying on top of this topic and sharing your information with us as we get it.
Thanks for staying on top of this. I'll send you that document.
Thank you. Please do. We'll post